Elkanah, who lived in Ramah in the region of Zuph, in the hill country of Ephraim. He was the son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph of Ephraim. Elkanah had 2 wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah did not. Each year, Elkanah would travel to Shiloh to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of Heaven's armies at the tabernacle. The priests of the Lord at the time were the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas. On the days Elkanah presented his sacrifice, he would give portions of meat to Peninnah and her children. And though he loved Hannah, he would give her only 1 choice portion, because the Lord had given her no children. So Peninnah would taunt Hannah and make fun of her, because the Lord had kept her from having children. Year after year it was the same. Peninnah would taunt Hannah as they went to the tabernacle. Each time, Hannah would be reduced to tears and would not even eat. "Why are you crying, Hannah?" Elkanah would ask. "Why aren't you eating? Why be downhearted just because you have no children? You have me. Isn't that better than having 10 sons?" Once after a sacrificial meal at Shiloh, Hannah got up and went to pray. Eli the priest was sitting at his customary place beside the entrance of the tabernacle. Hannah was in deep anguish, crying bitterly as she prayed to the Lord. And she made this vow: "O Lord of Heaven's armies, if you will look upon my sorrow and answer my prayer and give me a son, then I will give him back to you. He will be yours for his entire lifetime, and as a sign that he has been dedicated to God, his hair will never be cut." As she prayed to the Lord, Eli watched her, seeing her lips moving but hearing no sound. He thought she had been drinking. "Must you come here drunk?" he demanded. "Throw away your wine." "Oh no, sir," she replied. "I haven't been drinking wine or anything stronger, but I am very discouraged, and I was pouring my heart out to the Lord. Don't think I am a wicked woman, for I have been praying out of great anguish and sorrow." "In that case," Eli said, "go in peace. May the God of Israel grant your request you have asked of him." "Oh, thank you, sir," she exclaimed. Then she went back and began to eat, and she was no longer sad. The entire family got up early the next morning and went to worship the Lord once more. Then they returned home to Ramah. When Elkanah slept with Hannah, the Lord remembered her plea, and in due time she gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, for she said, "I asked the Lord for him."
Thank you, Farron. Excellent. Just thinking, I love Elkanah, and I think I'm going to take a leaf out of his book in just over a week's time. When I come home and I find Claire crying because Toby has left home, I'm going to say, "Why are you crying, Claire? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" I think that'll go down really well. Today, starting, as I said, new series for our sermon Sunday mornings, looking at the life of the prophet Samuel and looking at what we can learn about God from his life. Seeing how God interacts with Samuel, with the nation of Israel, with other individuals. Then looking in the light of Jesus' teaching, his sacrifice, our standing before God in the new covenant. And hopefully out of it, we will get an even more brilliant picture of who our God is. So in today's story, we enter at the very beginning, don't we? Very beginning of Samuel's life. In fact, before Samuel's life, he's not even being conceived as we join in. And this is not a normal conception, not a normal birth story. It's one that's full of sadness, rivalry, anguished prayers, and then ultimate joy. It also begins with what might seem at the outset a very strange portrayal of God. Yet, as we will see, probably the most appropriate and profound picture of God that we could ever have. So, we meet this family in Israel at the time of the Judges. Putting it in context, Moses had led Israel out of Egypt, wandering in the desert for 40 years, having received the law of the covenant, the 10 Commandments, all the other rules and regulations in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. Joshua had then taken over from Moses and led the army in triumph to claim the promised land. And then we've had probably around 275 years since Joshua's death of Israel being led by a succession of judges. They went through periods where, as a nation, they disobeyed God, where they were then defeated by foreign armies. They cried out to God, and then God rescued them, only for this to be repeated again and again. And it was in this setting that Elkanah lived with his 2 wives. One of his wives he loved, Hannah, but she didn't have children. The other wife, Peninnah, well, whatever Elkanah thought of her, she had at least produced him some heirs. This was a God-fearing and God-worshipping family. They regularly travelled to the tabernacle to worship, to sacrifice. And it's in this context that we come to the first portrayal of God in our story. It was God who had closed Hannah's womb, or as Farron read, God who had kept her from having children. Can you imagine for a moment that as a starting point for your testimony? Hi, Hannah, how are you? Tell me about this God that you worship. Oh, well, first things first, he closed my womb. He made it so that I couldn't have kids. Well, that's not really an opening statement that you want to be able to tell people about this God whom you worshipped. Imagine Hannah at this point saying, well, I worship God, but actually the interaction I have with him is that I know he's closed my womb. A seemingly heartless, maybe vindictive, certainly cruel act. Not the way you would want to portray God. Well, maybe it wasn't God. Maybe it was just one of those things in life. At the end of the day, we know in those days they didn't really understand the science behind fertility, cysts in fallopian tubes, sperm count, and all the rest of it. Maybe we could just put it down to science, but they just in their ignorance put it all down to God. No. Whatever the medical reason might have been, and there might have been one, they understood that actually God was ultimately responsible. They knew that God was the one who was responsible for issues of life and death, and for the gift of children. Psalm 139, for you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. Jeremiah, at the start of his prophecy, God says to him, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Psalmist again, children are a heritage from the Lord, offspring a reward from him. They understood that children, or the lack of children, was God's doing. Hannah wasn't the first woman recorded in the Bible to recognize this. Back in Genesis 16, Sarah says to her husband Abraham, the Lord has kept me from having children. For Hannah, her understanding of God was such that she accepted that it was God who had closed her womb, preventing her from having a child. She understood that it had nothing to do with being fair or just. She didn't degenerate into calling God names. Rather, she saw that God was in control and that it was only God who could do anything about it. She recognized that God was sovereign. Psalmist says, the plans of the Lord stand firm forever, the purposes of his heart through all generations. We see all the plans prophesied in the Old Testament being fulfilled through the life, death, resurrection of Jesus. Jesus himself, a demonstration of God's sovereignty. Acts 2, that I read from earlier today. Peter tells the crowd in Jerusalem that Jesus was handed over to them by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge. And God's sovereignty continues as we understand our own salvation. After Jesus has healed the man by the pool at Bethesda, and he's been challenged by his accusers, he says, for just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, even so the Son gives life to whom he is pleased to give it. And in Paul's letter to the church in Rome, he says, is God unjust? Not at all. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy. I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. Carries on saying, Paul does not the potter have the right to make out of the same lump of clay some pottery for special purposes and some for common use? Actually, I don't think we have much of a problem with this. I think we readily accept that God is in control, that he is in charge. I think where our problems come is that we want to understand why. Why did I lose my job? Why did cancer have to return? Why didn't you answer my prayer? Why do all these people have to die of coronavirus? Why have you closed my womb? We struggle with wanting to know why. As God says through the prophet Isaiah, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. God has plans God has reasons, but we won't always understand them or even know them. Hannah didn't know why God had closed her womb. She didn't need to know why God had closed her womb. She just knew that God had. He was sovereign. We could read this story and we could come up with our own reasons why we think God had closed Hannah's womb. That it was so that she would be in a position where she offers him back to God. That Samuel could be dedicated to God for his entire life. Maybe that was the reason why. Maybe God was waiting until the appropriate time for Samuel to come through. We don't know. And actually, God doesn't explain his reasons. Hannah didn't need to know why, but she knew God was in control. This should be our attitude when we wake up every morning. God is sovereign today. He is in control today. Whatever happens, God is in control. Whether I understand it or not, God is in control. Now, isn't that a fantastic way to begin the story of the life of Samuel? What on the face of it might seem like a cruel thing to do to a young woman, closing her womb, is actually, at the start of this book, a great statement about God's sovereignty. Whatever happens in this life, God is in control. But our passage doesn't stop there in its description of God. God is in control, yes, and he is a compassionate God. We see Hannah crying out to God, saying to God, see my misery, don't forget me, and if you give me a son, I'll give him back to you. Early the next morning, they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah lay with Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. The Lord remembered her. This is not a statement concerning the capacity God has to memorize stuff, people, situations. When you pray to God, God never says, well, hang on a minute. Now, who are you? Remind me what was going on in your life. That's not who God is. Saying that God remembered her doesn't mean to say that on other occasions he forgets who we are. No, the fact that God remembers Hannah, there's an action involved. God's knowledge of the situation that she is in has resulted in him expressing his love, his compassion for Hannah in power. She bears a son. It's the exact same when God remembers Noah and his family in the ark, setting them on dry ground. When God remembers Rachel, Jacob's wife, who was also unable to conceive. It was God who remembered Samson as he brought the house down on his enemies. Want to just read a bit of Jesus's teaching in Luke chapter 18. Then Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. He said, in a certain town there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared about men. And there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with the plea, grant me justice against my adversary. For some time he refused, but finally he said to himself, even though I don't fear God or care about men, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice, so that she won't eventually wear me out with her coming. And the Lord said, listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones, who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice, and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? Jesus portraying the judge, the person with power and authority, not wanting to be compassionate, just granting a wish just to get rid of the woman, and comparing him with God, who is sovereign, who is in control, who is all powerful, and saying that actually God is not like that judge, because God is loving and compassionate towards us. Samuel's conception and birth, we see God being sovereign. God at the start of this story is in absolute control. We need to accept that even when we don't always understand why. But God is also full of compassion and love. When we cry out to him, he hears from heaven and he answers us. God remembers us, his children. God remembers you. Let's pray together.